This is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, narrated by me, Kevin Daniel. President Johnson signed this in on April 9th, 1965, as one piece of many pieces of legislation in his war on poverty. The aim of the ESEA was to help the impoverished children become educated, to reduce the equality gap between the two socioeconomic groups. And in fact, it actually comes all the way back to FDR and his equality and his poverty legislations from the 40s. In education, we get Titles 1 through 9 from this legislation. The fact, obviously, Title 1, addressing students in poverty. You can see it also addressed bilingual and migrant students, libraries and textbook acquisition, special education, among others. And then lastly, sex-based discrimination protection. So it's not just education that comes in this legislation, but you also see some titles that affect anything that is tied to federal money. The funding that was supplied was adequate, but it was hard to use due to the fact that federal regulations made it difficult to get the money where it really needed to go. The money had to be dispersed by state governments, state education departments, because they did not want a fear to grow that the federal government was having too much control over education. And so the states were supposed to distribute it, but the federal government had stipulations on how it was distributed. For instance, an example, school-wide programs. If you wanted to implement one to help your school grow or develop, you had to match whatever Title I funds were given. And so it wasn't really a gift or a full funding, it was a half and half situation, which made it difficult for very impoverished communities, which is who this money was meant for in the first place. It also made it very difficult to even be a Title I school, with the fact that you had to have a 75% poverty level to even qualify for these funds. From this legislation, you see poverty levels tied to federal funds, which it had been tracked before, but now it was tied directly to money that was going to go to state departments and to schools. You also have a need to create state departments of education in states that didn't have them, because the money couldn't be directly given to these schools by the federal government. It had to go through the state department. And so you had an expansion and creation of state departments of education. The other side of this was that now states were much more involved in educational policy, because since they were the middleman for this money, they had a lot more sway in how legislation was passed and what was really important when it came to educational policy. You also have the invention of many different school improvement programs. Now that these programs could have funds to actually be realized, so the creation of a lot of different school improvement programs and the creation of student success programs. On curriculum assessment today, we see the connection obviously between federal funds and test scores. Okay, many times we sit there and we look at the system's test scores and who's going to be Title I and who's not, and who's performing and who's not, and how are we going to get these funds that we need to operate our systems. You also have the creation of assessment development companies like ACT and SAT, who are there to create the aligned assessments to the state standards that were required to be made by states after the creation of this act. And after so long, they realized that some states, their standards did not translate to productive and competitive individuals on a world stage. And so you have the creation of Common Core state standards, which is a little bit closer to the current situation we are in now. It also creates the culture that we have around assessment curriculum. How do we get this performance out of these students? How do we evaluate this data to get information, and are we growing? Because you need to grow to be able to get the funds you need, etc. And so that culture was created and still affects us today. Unfortunately, the students that this was targeted for did not benefit initially, um, due to that misuse of funds and how it was difficult to get the funds actually to the kids who really needed it. However, from this legislation, you have a shift in the culture of education into what it is today, where we are responsible for their growth. There is a huge shift to student centered education, and it doesn't matter if what you're doing today benefits you or the administrator or the system. The only thing that matters is what you're doing benefiting that child. And so ultimately, they benefit from that kind of culture. There's always going to be future impact, especially when you have federal money tied to curriculum and assessment. So there's always this potential for the federal government to control the direction of curriculum assessment in the future. What do these kids need to know? How do they need to be tested? And until states solely fund themselves and their educational systems, the federal government will always be able to have an impact. And the importance of this legislation is very obvious. You have the lead to accountability on all levels, from the state down, for kids' education. You have the creation of the U.S. Department of Education and state departments of education, the expansion of existing state departments, and state departments of education's influence in policy from then on. And of course, the creation of that emphasis of equality for every person, no matter creed, color, etc., to have an equal education, to have just as good an education as anybody else through this policy. Differences, I hope you go and you look at them and get your own conclusions, and I thank you for your time.